Much has been said about the shift during the Renaissance away from a God-centered view of the universe to a man-centered view. But where did women fit into the picture? On the one hand, there is the idealization of female beauty in much of the art and the literature, especially the poetry of this period.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
One of the most popular forms of English poetry in the 16th century was, of course, the sonnet, which had been introduced to English literature by Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, two important courtiers in the court of King Henry VIII. In introducing this form to English literature, they had been influenced by the earlier Italian sonnetteers, especially Dante and Petrarch, not only in their appropriation of the sonnet form, but also the dominant attitude and themes of the sonnet. The Italian sonnet, and later the English sonnet, celebrated human love between a man and a woman. The woman was idealized, deified, put on a pedestal by the lover.
Let others sing of knights and paladins, in aged accents and untimely words, paint shadows in imaginary lines, which well the reach of the high wits records. But I must sing of thee, and those fair eyes, authentic shall my verse in time to come, when yet the unborn shall say, lo, where she lies, whose beauty made him speak, that else was dumb. These are the arks, the trophies I erect, that fortify thy name against old age, and these thy sacred virtues must protect against the dark and time's consuming rage. Though the error of my youth they shall discover, suffice, they show I lived and was thy lover.
The stature or the position of the lady love is so much elevated, is put on such a high pedestal. This again is important, even if it is only notional, even if it is it has something to do with an idealism that had no relationship with the actual life of Elizabethan society. Even then it is important that ladies are being glorified. Lady love is the saint, is the goddess, is the brightest star, is the most beautiful object in the world, for which poets and noblemen yearn and care so much.
One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Vain man, said she, that dost in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For I myself shall like to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Not so, quoth I, let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall live by fame. My verse your virtues rare shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name, when whereas death shall all the world subdue, our love shall live, and later life renew.
The woman is glorified, but it is the lover who, in singing the praises of his beloved, is conferring the gift of immortalization on her. The woman very often does not have an identity of her own. She is merely the object of the lover's feelings of love for her. The indirect message is clear. Female beauty is a product of the male gaze. The woman is the object of the poet's feelings of love. She is cast in a passive role. Very rarely, in fact, in Renaissance art and literature, are women depicted as having any kind of active role at all. When women are depicted in any kind of active role, it is very often viewed in a suspicious light as something to be distrusted. We must remember that while on the one hand women were being glorified in the art and literature of the period, they were also being burnt at the stake as witches.
The 16th century institution of Petrarchan love, in fact, was a modification of the institution of courtly love which existed in the 13th century. Now, as it came to exist in the 16th century, it became the cult of the worship of the sonnet mistress as a goddess. However, this worship of the sonnet mistress almost as a goddess, wherein the poet lover became a votary, also did not leave any space for a reciprocal relationship. In some sense, as one prominent feminist historian points out in an essay very aptly titled, "Did Women Have a Renaissance?" the suggestion is that this cult in fact denatured women, robbed them of their body, of their very sexuality. And love of woman became a highly spiritualized emotion. It became in fact a stepping stone towards love which is more divine. This being the case, we can now examine the actual social position of women in the age. Legally, the position of women was very precarious. Women could not own property. The church laws stipulated that a father had the right to do as he pleased with his daughter. And after marriage, women surrendered their rights totally to their husbands. Women were also seen as morally flawed. In fact, the other picture, and a very striking picture, of the fears of a 16th century patriarchy that are available to us is that of the woman demonized as the witch. All over Europe, witch burning continued between the 15th and the 17th century. One pertinent question to ask at this point is, were all witches burned women? There were male witches too, but only 18% were men and an overwhelming 82% were women. The persecution of witches between the 15th and 17th century has several political and social reasons and factors. Now, witch trials, witchcraft trials, were conducted by the state, and the burning of a witch was seen as purging the countryside of evil. This purging the countryside of evil by the state gave the state a certain legitimacy. It was seen symbolically, at least, as re-establishing order and purging disorder and disobedience. Also, there were a series of economic crises during this period, especially between the 1580s up to nearly 1610. Women who were burnt as witches were mostly economic burdens on the community. They lived on the margins of the community, and it suited authority to make these figures the scapegoat at a point of economic crisis in the community. Also, at this point of time, increasing poverty, burden on the community, and the poor laws, the Elizabethan poor laws, which bureaucratized poverty relief, were also additional burdens, all of which contributed to the making of this marginal woman a scapegoat in the figure of the witch. Now, on one hand, at this point of time, we do have a very powerful woman at the helm of affairs, who is a woman, who is a female. However, it's interesting to see that whenever the intellectual attainments of Elizabeth were discussed, whenever she was praised by scholars of the period for her knowledge of language, for her intellectual abilities, she was addressed as the prince, and the gender here is significant. So Elizabeth was often seen not as an exceptional woman, but as a woman who, by her very exceptionality, by being exceptional, was far above the flaws and faults that characterized her sex.
There's an interesting amount of feminist research on this, which has shown that the bulk of women's portraits, especially in the early Renaissance, were in the form of a profile and following very fixed norms. And in these portraits, it was really the material objects, you know, the elaborate clothes, the jewelry of which the women wore, that were rendered with the most painstaking detail and finish. And while the profile as a form showed a woman with her gaze which was averted from the male viewer. The woman never looked at the male viewer directly in the eye, but it was an averted gaze, and the line of the profile really controlled her personality. So the language of the profile was intended to suppress any element of individuality in the woman and show her as a chaste, cloistered, virtuous woman. I think we can see this very effectively if we compare, you know, in a portrait of a male and a female, both in profile this time, and this I am talking about this diptych of the Duke and the Duchess of Urbino, painted by Piero della Francesca, court painter of the Duke of Urbino. Now, here the painter uses the profile for the male patron also for a very precise reason. The Duke of Urbino during his youth had an accident in which he lost one of his eyes. So, the profile was one way of hiding this this handicap in him. And but interestingly enough, if you look at the portrait of the Duke, you can see it's done in very vibrant colors in these panels of red, olive, which is his skin, and black. It's based on very simple lines. The Duke is shown against the background of his dominions, which is the idealized landscape, and the proportions of the painting show him clearly as the master of these dominions. The language of portraiture, however, brings out the inner, through its colors, the inner vibrant quality, the dynamism of this individual. Now, if we turn to the portrait of the Duchess, she again is set against this ideal landscape. If we look at her, what do we see? We see a lady who is powdered and plucked and decorated. She was in her 20s when this portrait of hers was painted, but looking at her, there is really not a single glimmer of youth which one can recapture in this painting. In fact, her face is just a pale sea of flesh, in which you have the individual features, her eyes, her nose, her lips, which don't add up to a whole personality. What is really focused is the rich brocade of her sleeve, a very elaborate hairdo and headdress. The pearls which she's wearing, seem to capture the glimmer of the landscape around them. I mean, there is an exquisite rendering of all the material details, and yet the woman as a person completely disappears under the force of these details. And this is something, I think, which became almost a formula for the representation of women in the profile form in portraits of this time.
This does not mean that women are never depicted in a positive, active role in Renaissance literature. In some of the plays of Shakespeare, notably some of his early comedies, the central figures are women who are intelligent as well as beautiful, and who, through their intelligence, actually come out in a more positive light than their male counterparts. Viola in Twelfth Night or Portia in The Merchant of Venice immediately come to mind. But even these positive women are seen as ultimately taking their rightful place in relation to the male. In other words, giving the male the role of lord and master and putting themselves in a subordinate position. This situation is very similar to our own in India today, where we have also had a very powerful woman in the topmost position of power, and where women also play an active part in the economic, social and cultural life of society. But at the same time, the social position of women is definitely subservient to men, despite their ostensible deification in religious mythology and the classical fiction of India, as well as in the contemporary popular forms of entertainment, popular cinema, or even in the pulp fiction of today.